What is up, YouTube? Katelyn Macias here, and today I have a lesson for you guys, Photography Basics 101. We're going to be talking aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, I'm going to explain everything in a really easy to understand manner, but I'm also going to teach you guys the right way. I have seen so many videos talking about photography basics or photography 101 or whatever it might be, and they explain some things out of order, reverse order, they make it really complicated. I'm going to explain everything to you guys. Hopefully after this video, you should have no questions, but if you do, feel free to ask them in the comments below and I will get back to you guys. After you watch this video, make sure you check out part 2, which will be linked in this video and also in the description below, where I talk about how these things interact with each other, how you can manipulate them to get the photo that you want, and how to shoot in manual mode. So make sure you check out that part 2, because this part 1 is a foundation, but the whole point of having a foundation is so you can build a building. So guys, there's really no point in knowing all this information, but not knowing how to apply it or how to use it or how to use it to make your photos look good. So that is what part 2 is about. So let's roll this intro and get right into it, because we have a lot of content to cover today. So point number 1 we're going to talk about is ISO. Basically, the definition of ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. Now, the ISO values range from 100 all the way up to 6,400 or 6,400, and some cameras actually go higher than that, but most cameras range up to 6,400. So 100 is the lowest. So lower the number, so 100 to 400 is typically like a lower ISO. So 100 and 400, lower the number, less sensitive your camera is to light. So when do you use this? When it's bright and sunny out. Why? If the sun is out, your camera doesn't need to be super sensitive to light. If your camera was super sensitive to light when it's bright and sunny out, all of your images will be totally overexposed. So when is your camera supposed to be sensitive to light? In low light conditions, when the ISO number is higher, 4, 5, 6, 7, 800, 1,000, 1,200, bigger numbers. That is when your camera is more sensitive to light. So let's say you're at a party, it's a night party, and it's very, very dim, and there's like a few sparklers and stuff. Your camera ISO is probably gonna be pretty high, like 3,200, because that little teeny tiny spark on the sparkler and the little dim light above it, the camera's like, this is all I got to work with? All right, I'll just take that light and just blow it up. I will expose your whole image based on that light. And the camera also creates some artificial light. It like artificially brings up the shadows and stuff like that. In conclusion, lower numbers, smaller numbers, less sensitive to light, bright, outdoor, sunny. Higher number, higher sensitivity to light, darker scenes, nighttime, dimmer. Now, there is a trade-off. The lower the ISO for the bright and sunny scenes, your image, your video gonna be super crisp and sharp. Once you get into the higher ISOs, like 800, 1,000, it starts to add grain to your picture and your video. Some people also call this noise. Now, if you don't know what this is, here is a perfect example of what it is. Look at this photo. See how it's like very pixelated and kind of like blurry, and it's just not crisp. That is grain and noise. That is what happens when you turn your ISO up super high. Now, there is a tool in editing called noise reduction, so that'll help some, but you guys have to be careful with this trade-off, because you can't completely take out all the noise in editing, because then your photo looks like this, and then it just looks really weird and fake and not very good. So only use higher ISOs when absolutely necessary. ISO should be the last setting you change. You should be changing your aperture and shutter speed before you change ISO because of this. You want your images to be crisp and sharp. So do not adjust ISO until you've already exhausted all other options. That's also why I started with ISO, because I want you guys to understand this is like what can make or break your image. If your aperture is off or your shutter speed's off, you can kind of blur out the background in editing. And shutter speed, that one is a little bit harder to fix, but it's not like it's gonna completely mess up an image. ISO, if you have too much grain or your image is too dark because you didn't use the proper ISO, your camera wasn't sensitive enough to light, your entire image could be ruined. This is really important to grasp and get the hang of. All right, we're gonna move on to aperture. This is also called depth of field. So if you hear photographers say like, oh, depth of field, they're talking about aperture. This is basically the blurriness of the background. You see those nice pictures where the background's blurred out and everyone's like, oh, it looks so good. Well, that is aperture. Now, aperture Aperture is referenced as f-stops. So if you hear a photographer say 1.8 f-stop, they're really just saying 1.8 aperture. It's just the name people use for aperture. Scientists have fancy lingo, and doctors, us photographers, we wanted some too. So we came up with f-stops. So this is one of the mistakes that other videos teach. They usually teach that smaller the number or smaller the f-stops, so like a 1.8, the bigger your camera lens gets. You know, like the camera lens, when you turn it to focus, the like little hole gets bigger and smaller. Yeah, that's aperture. So they teach smaller the number, bigger the camera hole, but more blurred the background is. So if you're trying to take a picture, you want to blur out the background, you have to sit there and be like, so I need a smaller number, bigger hole in order to have more blurred background. What? No. This is the easier way, okay? If you want less of your picture in focus, use a smaller number, use a smaller aperture. So let's say you have a portrait of a person and they're behind some trees. If you want the trees blurred, if you want less of your picture in focus, use a smaller number. You don't have to go through all those hoops, a smaller number, bigger hole, more blur. Like, what? No. If you want less focus, smaller number. It's that simple. Now, Aperture also has some drawbacks, and I actually talked about one of these in my photography mistakes video, which will also be linked in this video and in the description below. You have to be careful with Aperture that you don't use too wide of an aperture, which, by the way, when people say wide of an aperture, they're regarding to like the hole, because remember I said smaller the number, bigger the hole. So wide aperture is bigger hole, but anyways. So if you're using too wide of an aperture, too low of a number, like a 1.8, and you're trying to get multiple things in focus, well, if you have 3 subjects, 1, 2, you know what? I have a whiteboard. Can you guys see me? Okay, change of plans. I'm gonna just draw it out and then just show it to you guys. So let's say you have 3 subjects, right? Or a group, whatever it might be, and you want to blur out the background. Well, if you use too low of an aperture, for example, a 1.8, then some of your subjects are going to be blurred out. For example, oh shoot. See, for example, the circle. All right, I'm gonna just stand up. So for example, you have 3 subjects, 1, 2, 3. Let's say you're using a 1.8 aperture. Well, your whole background's gonna be blurred out, but see how some of your subject here also gets blurred out? Literally half the subject, because you're using too wide of an aperture, too much of the background's blurred out, that now your subjects are starting to be blurred on the edges here and a little bit down here. So you guys have to be careful that when using Aperture, you know which aperture to use. You know how wide you need to use it. You know how much background you need. And again, I talk about some of this in my photography mistakes video, and I go through some of my mistakes I've made and some examples, so you guys can check that video out. So if you guys want to take notes, write down ISO, camera sensitivity to light, and then under it, just write smaller ISO, less sensitive to light, and then you can write like sunny day, bright scenes, whatever. And then higher number, like 800, 1600, more sensitive to light, good for nighttime or dimmer scenes or whatever. And then aperture, write depth of field / background blur, and then write down smaller f-stops, less of my picture will be in focus, bigger f-stops, f22, more of my picture will be in focus. All right, so now we're moving on to shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how long the shutter of a camera is open for. So you're gonna take a picture and hear the little that is your shutter speed. So if you have a slower shutter speed, for example, 1 second, your camera's gonna go 1 Mississippi. So that's a super slow shutter speed. Faster shutter speeds, like 1/5000th of a second, is going I can't even do it. It's just so fast. So slower shutter speeds are really, really good for stills. Like if your camera's on a tripod, it's really, really good to have a slow shutter speed if you're capturing like a starry night or a star picture. Those are really cool. Or a city. at night, like a cityscape at night. The cars moving cause like light trails and stuff. There's a lot of cool effects you can do with shutter speed. I'll make that for another video. Slower shutter speed causes motion blur. If you're trying to take a picture of someone running with a slow shutter speed, they're gonna come out blurry. It's not gonna be a good photo. Faster shutter speeds, for example, 1/5000th of a second. Pretty sure I said that weird, but it's fine. That's gonna freeze motion. So sports, every time I do sports photos, my shutter speed is always like 1/5000th of a second. Moving objects, things like that. Anything that's moving, you're probably gonna wanna use a faster shutter speed for. Now there are exceptions. For example, people use slow shutter speeds to make water look really smooth. And when you look at a waterfall and you see pictures of waterfalls, if you use a fast shutter speed, this is what it would look like. But that is why people put their camera on a tripod, use a slower shutter speed. That way their waterfall looks like this. See the water, it's very smooth and silky and it just looks good. So that is basically shutter speed. It's probably the easiest one to understand out of the three. So that is basically ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So now that you guys know the basics of photography, you have that foundation, go watch part 2 and go watch my photography mistakes video so you can start building up, building that building, and so you guys can actually start going out and taking photos. Video 2 is going to be very, very important because you have to understand the trade-offs between these, because if you use a lower aperture to blur out the background, that lets in more light because the hole is bigger, whereas if you use f/22, yeah, your image is going to be in focus and it'll be crisp and sharp, but the hole is probably about that big. So you're going to have almost no light coming in. So you're going to have to bump up your ISO, which, as we talked about, causes image grain. So what do? You can slow down the shutter speed to go to let in more light, but now your image is blurry. So there's a lot of variables to think about with these three things. That is why you need to go watch part 2 so you guys can understand how those interact and how you can manipulate them to get the photo that you want and start shooting in manual mode and start getting amazing photos. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully this helped. If it did, like, comment, and subscribe because I have more great content coming for you guys. Also, real quick, I'm gonna have some notes for you guys in the comment section because I know some of this was a kind of a lot, or maybe it was hard to follow and hard to track. So I am gonna have some comments and some notes for you guys in the comment section, so make sure you check that out. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.